Well, this is one of my favorite subjects. 15 minutes, I have to sort of hit the high points and can't cover all of it. But I'm going to just start off by giving a little basis and try to emphasize through the talk what Guyton was actually trying to achieve. I think his point is often missed. We get into these funny arguments, but there's really a few really crucial points that he makes. Well, just going back, there's a paper I wrote called Hemodynamic Monitoring Guyton at the Bedside, which covers all the materials that I'm dealing with today. So, just starting off, what did Arthur Guyton actually say? We keep hearing about him all the time. He actually created a significant paradigm shift. Prior to Guyton, the control of cardiac output was thought of in terms of heart rate, stroke volume, and contractility. That's how you decide, did you get more in or out. Little thought was given to how blood actually gets back to the heart. He actually credits Ernest Starling for realizing that filling of the heart is dependent upon what comes back, the venous return. So this is actually a very old concept that seems to get lost between the turn of the 20th century and then until back up to the 50s or 60s of the 20th century. So Starling realized the venous return is dependent upon an upstream pressure, and he actually introduced this term, mean systemic filling pressure. And there's even a paper in the German literature by Weber back in the 1880s or so, also looking at this concept. So in his American Journal of Physiology paper in 1957, this is what he wrote. When a change occurs in the hemodynamics of the circulatory system, one cannot predict what will happen to the cardiac output unless he, that time it was only he, takes into consideration both the effects of this change on the ability of the heart to pump blood and also the tendency of blood to return to the heart from vessels. So let me elaborate that concept a little further. When you stretch an elastic structure, the veins and venules, the volume creates an elastic recoil pressure. So I fill it up with volume, I clamp it, and when I release that clamp, there will be a fluid flow out of that elastic structure. If I increase the volume, I will have a greater flow out of that elastic structure. So the principles of flow from this very simple system are this. You have a stress volume, a compliance, and a resistance. The stress volume is the volume that actually came out. So this thing emptied, and this is the volume that came out. So that volume was the volume that stretched the wall, and the volume that's left is unstressed. There's a compliance, which is how stretchy the wall is, or its inverse is elastance. And there's a resistance draining it. So there's a compliance, which is the stretch, a resistance draining it, and the volume you fill it. Those are the three characteristics that determine how that structure will empty. Now, where does the heart come into this? So the heart has what I like to call a permissive role. It lowers the downstream pressure, and by doing that, it allows that recoil to take place and that flow to come back to the heart. So the role of the heart in this model is it's permissive, it is allowing that recoil to occur and drain the blood back. Now it obviously has another very important secondary role. You got to get the blood back or you won't have a circulation. So I call this a restorative function. It actually gets it back. Now, to understand this a bit further is my concept of the bathtub, which is, I guess, my extrapolation from Guyton. So the principle of the bathtub is that about 70% of your blood volume is in your venules and veins. So that region, at a low pressure, so that region of the circulation acts as a large reservoir of fluid. Now, it means if you have a large volume with a low pressure, it's very compliant. So the model that is being used here, and also in Guyton's analysis, is what's called a lumped parameter model. You're assuming that the bulk of the volume is in one place, and that's a very good assumption, and therefore it determines the draining of the peripheral system. That volume creates a height which drives the fluid out through the bottom, and we call that in the veins and venules the mean systemic filling pressure. Now importantly in a system like this, the volume coming in, the tap provides volume and pressure. But it's only the volume per minute, the amount of volume coming into the tub that actually matters and not the pressure. The volume adds to the height, and creates that force that's driving the fluid out of the tub. But the force, the pressure coming out of the tap, has no effect because it only can act by changing the height. So that means the arterial pressure flowing into the veins and venules is not important for how they empty. It's only the volume you deliver that stretches the veins and venules that counts. Now, in your bathtub, you have an endless supply of flow coming from whatever water source supplies your residence. But in the vascular system, there is no other fluid. So the heart really can't add much. It's not completely true. You can, by being more efficient, you can recruit a little bit of volume from the pulmonary circuit to the systemic circuit, but it changes the pressure maybe about 0.5 to 1 millimeter of mercury. It's not a big effect, but it is there, but not that crucial. So there is only one source of volume, and the heart is essentially dependent upon that return. So the characteristics of the return become extremely important on what the heart can actually do. Now, going back to the model, if we emptied all the volume out, and then we try to lower the pressure further with the heart, bing, you can't have any flow. So you have to have that volume in the system. That's why it's so essential. Now, another important point, I've already introduced the concept of stressed and unstressed volume. So another important part is that, as I showed you with the balloons, a certain amount of volume doesn't come out. On the model, that would be as if I had the opening on the side of the model. So only the volume above can create that mean systemic filling pressure, and the volume below that is unstressed and doesn't come out. And it's estimated that about 30%, maybe a little less, of total blood volume is stressed, and only about 70%, and 70% is unstressed. That means that there's only about 1.3 to 1.4 liters of most of us that's actually driving the fluid around. And it's really worth thinking about that when you're resuscitating somebody. If you give 2 liters of a colloid thinking you're filling the vasculature, you're not. There's just no space for it to do that. It makes absolutely no sense physiologically. So here's the basic model. And what Guyton's really big point is he divided the pattern into 2 functions. A return function, which I just talked about, how that elastic structure empties, and a cardiac function, which helps lower the right atrial pressure and puts it back again. So you have these 2 intersecting functions that determine the cardiac output, the venous return, and the right atrial pressure. So let's look at the cardiac function for a moment. That should be easy for all of you. Good old Starling's law. The greater the preload, the greater the output, up to a plateau. And once you hit that plateau, further volume loading doesn't help the cardiac output anymore. I call this wasted preload. Now, Guyton's other great contribution in my mind is he provided this graphical approach. Although it simplifies things, it's a very good approximation. And what it allows is a graphical analysis of the intersection of these 2 mathematical functions, a return function and a cardiac function. And graphically, it's very easy to solve their intersection. Algebraically, it gets quite a messy equation and not so easy, but graphically, very easy. So starting off with the venous side, the venous function, we said the job of the heart was to lower the right atrial pressure relative to the bathtub. When the right atrial pressure is equal to the upstream pressure, the flow is 0, which is the x-intercept. And what the heart does, it lowers the right atrial pressure, and the lower the right atrial pressure, the greater the return up to a maximum, which I'll get to in a moment. Okay. All right, so and the slope of this line is -1 over the resistance to venous return. Now, an important point happens when the right atrial pressure falls below the surrounding pressure. If you're breathing in atmosphere, then around the atmospheric pressure. When that happens, you get what's called a vascular waterfall. And in this concept, once you have collapse of vessels, downstream pressures no longer affect flow. The amount of water that goes over a waterfall is affected by the upstream characteristics of how wide the river is upstream, the rocks in the river upstream, but it is not affected by the height of the falls. Niagara Falls could be 1 meter high or 34 meters high, but there would be no difference in flow through the falls. There's a difference of power loss, and the city of Toronto would be dark if it was only 1 meter, but it does not affect the flow. So what this means is, as the heart starts moving, pumping the pressures more and more negative, you get into this flat part of the venous return curve. Now that doesn't stop flow, it limits further changes based on the heart. This has a very subversive significance, but it really explains why his concept's so powerful. So if we try to look at what's the maximum amount of blood that can go back to the heart? Well, the equation is simply the mean systemic filling pressure, that upstream value, the right atrial pressure downstream, and the resistance between them. So the best the heart can do is lower right atrial pressure to 0. So when that happens, you have maximum flow, which means you could take the heart out of the system and you would have the maximum possible flow in the circuit. It's only for an instant and all your blood's on the floor, but that is the maximum value and the heart can never do better. So you put these two functions together because they have the same axes, and where they intersect, that is the right atrial pressure. And that's why one of the absurdities in Paul Merrick's analysis and said, oh, right atrial pressure doesn't predict anything. Well, of course it doesn't, because it's determined by these two functions back and forth, and a single value will not tell you. It's the dynamics that count. I don't have a lot of time for that, but maybe I'll just briefly just get into what happens with two things, how we increase function and increase volume. So first of all, increasing function shifts the cardiac function curve upwards. So how does that look in the grand scheme of things? So here's the venous return curve and the model on the left. So if I increase cardiac function, here's the initial gradient. What that does, it shifts the cardiac function curve upwards. It lowers right atrial pressure, and therefore I have an increased gradient for venous return. It is as if I just took the heart and I lowered it relative to the bathtub. That would do exactly the same. It allowed more to come back. Importantly, you'll see there's a lower right atrial pressure with a higher cardiac output. And I'll skip that one for the sake of time. Just going the other way. Okay, what about volume, which you do all the time? So with volume, I fill up the tank. I get a higher mean systemic filling pressure. I've moved up the compliance line of the vasculature. That shifts the venous return curve to the right, and that increases cardiac output by moving up the Starling curve. And in this situation, I have a rise in output with a rise in right atrial pressure. So if I have a dominant effect of the periphery, the output rises with a rise in right atrial pressure. And if I have a dominant cardiac effect, then the output rises with a fall in right atrial pressure. So using these simple numbers, you can get an idea about dealing with a return problem or a heart problem or a return benefit or a heart benefit. And I'll skip these again, just going the other way for time. The other thing is you can recruit unstressed into stress volume by changing the tone of the veins and venules. It's called a decrease in capacitance. It shifts it to the left so that for any given total volume, I have a higher mean systemic filling pressure. And that will end up looking exactly like volume. It'll cause, it's actually effectively like lowering the opening on the tub. That shifts the pressure volume line, moves the venous return curve to the right. Do this. And it looks identical to giving volume. This is your body's way of giving an auto transfusion. I think I'm probably almost out of time. Yeah. Okay. 2 minutes? Okay. So that's a change in vascular capacitance. I'm glad I got 2 minutes. This is a very important factor regulating the system, which we actually don't really pay much attention to. And we can't, because you cannot measure it clinically. Even in an animal, it takes great difficulty, as you well knows. So you have to remember that it's increased by vasodilators, alpha-adrenergic blockers, and sedation. And you have to think about the volume reserves in your patient. Has this patient been bleeding? Have they been heavily diuresed? Have they had great gastrointestinal losses? Have they been walking through the desert at 55 degrees? Those patients have been using up their reserves. So be careful in those patients of giving narcotics or vasodilators, because you will find that they were being held together by this tone and they will crash. So I think I'm just going to skip on to the end for the sake of time. Yeah, well, I'll skip this. We'll just go to my conclusion. Sorry. I gotta move on to these, but I'll get to that. Okay, in summary. So cardiac output is determined by the interaction of a pump function and a return function. This is Guyton's crucial point, and it's often not appreciated, this simple point, but it's a really important one. The intersection of these two functions is given by the right atrial pressure and the cardiac output and the venous return. So those single values are defined by these two functions. So tracking changes in right atrial pressure and cardiac output together are very useful diagnostically and therapeutically to figure out what you're doing. Thank you.